Hey, hope you're doing okay out there. Whatever brought you here tonight, I just want to say, I'm glad you showed up. But before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever taken a wrong turn, only to realize later it wasn't a mistake, it was an invitation? Because some places don't wait for you to find them, they find you. Let's begin. Sometimes it starts with a whisper you pretend not to hear. Other times it starts with a house that watches back. This first story is about what happens when the walls begin to remember. Story 1. The House That Learned to Scream. Under the heavy clouds of early November, Derek Malone arrived in Fairgrove, Missouri with a second-hand toolbox, a rusted pickup, and a quiet sense of finality trailing behind him like a loose thread. Recently divorced and resigned from his job as a municipal engineer, he had taken what little he had left and poured it into an old Victorian house at the edge of town. The listing called it historic with character, but the neighbors called it the one that won't stay sold. It sat on cracked brickwork with leaning porch pillars and flaked paint like sunburned skin. But Derek saw something else entirely. He saw a project. Something broken that could be made right. He spent the first 2 days cleaning dust thick enough to write memories in. But on the third night, as the wind curled around the frame of the house like a whispering intruder, he heard it. The scream. Not a human scream? Not exactly. It rose up through the drain in the upstairs bathroom, faint and distant like a sob, trying to claw its way through miles of copper and steel. He froze, then bent close. Think it may be a neighbor's plumbing echoed strangely, but the house next door had been vacant for years. The sound came again, the next night louder. It was almost rhythmic, like a cry held in the throat of something too tired to wail properly. He recorded it, but playback only gave static and faint hissing. He posted in a plumber's forum. They joked about haunted pipes, pressure bursts, airlocks, but no one could explain why it came precisely at 3:33 a.m. every night. As a man who had built his life on pressure gauges and blueprints, Derek needed answers. He tore through the walls behind the sink and found nothing abnormal. He replaced valves, sealed joints, drained the system, but the scream returned. Some nights it sounded like words too garbled to decipher, sometimes like pleading. By the end of the week, Derek stopped sleeping. The house seemed to resist silence. The more he tried to fix, the worse the noises became. Faucets hissed when untouched pipes groaned during daylight. When he brought it up to a neighbor, an old man with a milky eye and slow speech, the man simply said, "You shouldn't have disturbed the basement." But there was no basement, not according to the floor plan. Still, something in Derek insisted he look. In the kitchen behind a rotting cabinet, he found a small door behind drywall, bricked up like a secret confession. The bricks were old and crumbling. It took less than an hour to break through. What he found was a stairwell descending into thick, damp darkness. The air changed with every step he took, like walking into lungs filled with mildew. At the bottom, the space was narrow and low-ceilinged, and in one corner sat a rusted chair bolted to the floor. Beside it, a length of chain and what looked like scratch marks along the stone wall. Behind a loose panel, he found a small tin box, sealed with wax that crumbled under his fingers. Inside were several pages of a child's notebook, each one stained with age and streaked with a hand that clearly trembled. Her name was Mabel. She had been kept here, that much was clear. She wrote of being punished for noise, of learning to be quiet, of trying to send her voice into the pipes so someone would hear. The final entry simply read, "They told me no one wants to listen to crying girls, but I won't be quiet forever." That night, Derek didn't try to sleep. He sat in the bathroom, staring at the drain. At 3:33 a.m., it began. But this time the scream was not alone. It came with a gust of steam from the faucet, a sudden burst of heat, and then the whisper of his name. The mirror fogged, and across the glass appeared the words written in invisible fingers. You opened the door. The next night, the pipes shrieked all day. Water burst from the downstairs sink, boiling hot. Though no heater was connected, the toilet flushed on its own. The house trembled. Still, Derek refused to leave. He needed to know what it all meant. The following evening, he returned to the basement, clutching Mabel's notebook to his chest. He sat in the chair, the chain limp at his side. He whispered that she was heard, that someone finally heard. The pipes were silent that night, but at 3:33 a.m., the silence turned violent. The bathroom door slammed shut. The ceiling creaked. The walls moaned. From the drain rose a shriek so high and sharp it felt like it split the air. When Derek tried to stand, blood spilled from his ears. He blacked out. He awoke in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines he could no longer hear. The diagnosis was simple. Both eardrums ruptured beyond recovery. He never spoke of what happened. No one would have believed it anyway. He never returned to the house. Fairgrove filed for condemnation, but no demolition crew would touch it. The workers claimed they heard crying from inside the walls, and one said he saw a girl standing in the upstairs window, mouthing words he couldn't understand. To this day, the house still stands. Children cross the street when passing it. The plumbing has long since decayed, yet on some nights those nearby swear they hear sobbing through the sewer grates. What matters is not whether Derek was right or broken or cursed. What matters is that someone finally listened. Not all ghosts seek revenge. Some only want to be heard. Some cries aren't meant to be silenced. Some pipes once taught to carry pain will never forget the sound of suffering. The house didn't scream because it was haunted. It screamed because it remembered. Not all hauntings are loud. Some slip into your life quietly, like a familiar voice on the edge of sleep. And sometimes that voice doesn't belong to the living. Story 2. The lamp that wouldn't turn off. When Valerie Kemp moved into the little yellow house on the outskirts of Athens, Georgia, she told herself it was a beginning, not an escape. The past few years had carved quiet hollows in her, the kind no one else could see. The job she left behind didn't matter. The friends who stopped calling didn't either. And the memories, especially. The memories were just things that hadn't faded enough yet. The house was modest. A single story with peeling shutters and a sunroom that smelled of dry leaves. It was quiet, which she liked. No city hum, no building alarms. Just the wind through the trees and the occasional mockingbird sounding too much like laughter. On her first day while unpacking the garage, she found the lamp. It sat in a box labeled miscellaneous, nestled between a broken clock and a dusty book on American wildflowers. The lamp was ceramic ivory, colored with faint cracks along the base, topped with a beige shade, yellowed by time. It had no switch, just a pull cord, and when she plugged it in, it glowed softly. She didn't remember turning it on that night, but at 3:03 a.m. the light was on. She blinked into the golden haze, disoriented, then unplugged it and went back to sleep. The next night it happened again. The cord untouched the plug, out of the wall, yet the lamp glowed like it had something to say. Valerie checked the bulb, the outlet, even the wiring behind the table, but everything seemed normal. She laughed it off, telling herself, maybe it had some battery backup. She didn't understand, but on the fourth night, she didn't laugh. At 3:03, the lamp blazed brighter than before, casting long shadows across the room. And in the chair opposite her bed, framed perfectly in the light, sat a figure. It took her a moment to understand what she was seeing. The figure wasn't moving. It wasn't breathing. It was her. Dressed in a black dress she hadn't worn in decades, hair tied the way her mother used to tie it, the version of herself that stood at a funeral. She never cried through. The light flickered, and the chair was empty again. She told herself she was dreaming that stress and solitude were playing games with her mind, but she didn't unplug the lamp that night, or the next. When it lit up, she stared at it, waiting for something to change. Sometimes the light would sway, casting unfamiliar shadows on familiar walls. Sometimes she'd feel warmth on the side of her face, like someone had leaned close to whisper. She bought a new lamp, then two. But they all did the same thing. At 3:03 a.m., the old one would still glow. She threw it away, left it on the curb with the rest of the trash. The next morning, it was back on her nightstand. She tried filming it. At 3:03, the camera picked up static. Then 2 frames of her sleeping. Then 2 frames of her sitting upright, eyes open, staring directly at the camera with no expression. Then nothing. She stopped recording. She stopped trying to explain. One night, desperate, she walked to the lamp, sat in the chair that only her shadow had occupied before, and whispered, "What do you want?" The lamp flickered. The room remained silent, but inside her something shifted. She began dreaming again. Dreams she hadn't had since she was 8, of her mother's voice behind the bathroom door, of the silence that followed. She remembered the knock she never made, the words she never said, the funeral dress, the look her aunt gave her when she didn't cry. The light always came at 3:03. One night it arrived early at 2:45. The lamp snapped on with a sound like breath catching. Valerie woke to find herself already standing. In the corner of the room was a child, barely 8. Her eyes wide, her shoulders trembling. The same dress, the same tied hair. Valerie's hands shook. She reached forward, but the girl didn't move. She only stared, her lips barely parting to mouth the words, "You left me there." Valerie collapsed to the floor. The lamp flickered violently. Light bled through the walls, painting the room in a pale yellow scream. The girl stepped forward, not angry, not blaming, just broken. Valerie wrapped her arms around the child, and for a moment nothing else existed. No house, no time, no memory. Just 2 versions of the same soul, one asking to be seen, the other finally ready to look. When she opened her eyes again, it was morning. The lamp was gone. Not broken, not hidden, gone. She searched the house, top to bottom, nothing. That night, nothing lit up. At 3:03, there was only darkness. It felt quieter than it had in years. Over the next weeks, Valerie lived differently. She started walking in the morning, speaking to her neighbors, letting the wind pass through her, instead of holding her breath. She bought a new lamp, a small modern one that responded to natural light. It flickered once when she brought it home, then settled like it knew its place. On her final night before returning to work, she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her collar. For the first time in years, her eyes didn't avoid their reflection. In the glass, she was alone. No shadow behind her. No echo of what she used to be. Just her, just enough. Not all ghosts come to haunt. Some come to heal. Some lights don't mean to blind. They simply remind us where we stopped looking. While some echoes stay in our homes, others follow us to places we thought were safe. Like an apartment, a ceiling, a set of footsteps that never needed permission. Story 3. Nobody lives upstairs. When Miguel Rojas moved into apartment 4B of the aging tenement on Pineview Avenue, he told himself it would be temporary. Just long enough to get back on his feet after the divorce. Long enough to rebuild some savings and get away from the memories of the house that wasn't his anymore. The building was older than it looked in the photos, with peeling beige walls, cracked tiles, and a faint smell of wet dust that clung to everything. But it was cheap and it was quiet, or so the landlord promised. The first night was uneventful. He unpacked the basics, set his alarm for work, and lay in bed watching headlights glide across the ceiling. But just as he started drifting off, he heard it. Soft, steady footsteps above him pacing. At first he assumed it was a neighbor, maybe a night owl. But the next morning, when he casually mentioned it to the maintenance guy in the hallway, the man blinked at him and said, "There's no one in 5B. Hasn't been anyone in years." Miguel didn't say anything else, but the footsteps returned the next night. Same time, too. It's your order well. Same rhythm, a slow dragging step, back and forth, not quite heavy, not quite light, just persistent. He tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. He turned on the TV, blasted music, even slept with headphones, but at 2 sharp, the sound came louder, closer, more defined. It wasn't just pacing. It was like someone circling the same path over and over again, sometimes stopping right above his bed. Miguel wasn't a superstitious man. He had served overseas, survived worse than creaky apartments. But something about these footsteps, it wasn't fear exactly. It was unease, like he was being studied, watched mirrored. One night, curiosity overtook him. He climbed the stairwell to the 5th floor, stood outside 5B. The door was chained shut, rust crusting around the latch. The window beside it was fogged with age and dust lined the sill like a warning. He pressed his ear to the wood. Silence. That night he dreamt of fire, a hallway filled with smoke, a child's laughter echoing down a blackened corridor. He woke with the taste of soot in his mouth. The footsteps came again. He began to notice other things. Light bulbs flickering in the hallway when he passed his front door, sometimes ajar in the morning, though he knew he'd locked it. Once he found small wet footprints on his kitchen tile, too small to be too clean to be from outside. He stopped inviting people over. Not that many people visited anyway. He didn't tell anyone what he heard or what he thought he saw when the bathroom mirror fogged for no reason. He started recording his nights. Most of the audio was normal creaks, distant traffic, but always right at 2 a.m. The recordings dipped into static. Then came the footsteps, clear as day, and something else. A faint giggle, childlike, soft, wrong. He played it over and over, volume up, volume down, trying to rationalize it. But no amount of logic could explain the way the laugh lingered just a little too long. He thought maybe he was losing his mind. Maybe the stress, the silence, the weight of loneliness, it could warp the brain. But then came the moment that changed everything. He looked up one night, half awake, and saw the ceiling above his bed was marked with dust. Faint streaks. He grabbed a chair, climbed up, and ran his fingers along the spot dust smeared away to reveal prints. Bare footprints, small like a child's, positioned as if someone had been walking upside down above him. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table lamp on recording, running heart thudding louder than the fridge. At 2:00 a.m., the footsteps began, but this time they weren't above. They were in the hallway. Slowly, they came down the stairs. Soft, hesitant. Then came a knock. Not loud, not demanding. Just a single deliberate knock on his door. Miguel stood frozen. The peephole showed nothing. When he opened the door, the hallway was empty, but at his feet lay a photograph. Half-burned edges curled like leaves in autumn. In the picture was a young boy, maybe 8 or 9, standing in what looked like apartment 5B. Behind him, the wall was blackened. Smoke damage. The child's face was partly melted by flame. The back of the photo was blank. Miguel didn't know what to do. He wanted to move out, but something inside him, call it guilt, call it instinct, needed to understand. The next night, he pried open the chain on 5B. The door groaned like a wound splitting open. Inside was silence. Thick, choking silence. The room smelled of mildew and something older. Ash, maybe. The walls were bare, except for one patch that was darker, fire-scarred. In the corner, a pile of soot lay like an unburied memory. Miguel stepped forward. The floor creaked, but then above him, footsteps, perfectly mimicking his. He moved. They moved. He stopped. They stopped. He turned in place. They turned too. A mirror and footfalls. He backed out, slowly closed the door, and never returned. He moved within the week, told the landlord he was leaving for family reasons, didn't ask for the deposit, didn't want it. But even now, in a different city, different building ground floor, no less at 2:00 a.m., he sometimes hears it, that slow circling step, that giggle faint as dust. Not all haunting shout, some whisper, some simply repeat, over and over until someone listens. Not every ghost wants revenge. Some just want to finish a loop that was never broken. Some echoes belong to those who were forgotten while still walking. And sometimes footsteps don't come from above. They come from below, from within, from where you swore silence used to live. What if the thing that's haunted is your own reflection? Our next story shows how even a mirror can become a doorway, and what happens when something on the other side finally steps through. Story 4. Where the Mirror Opens. Sierra Douglas didn't believe in hauntings, but she did believe in memory and how certain spaces held on to emotion. The way old walls hold on to heat. The house she and Mason moved into in Savannah was one of those places heavy with its own quiet history. Built before electricity shaped by storms and silence, it had warped floorboards, antique doorknobs, and a gabled attic that hadn't been touched in decades. It was Mason's idea to buy it a project to work on together, but Sierra had agreed only because she didn't know where else to go after walking away from the classroom and the version of herself she'd worked so hard to become. On their third weekend there, while Mason was sanding the porch rails, Sierra climbed the attic steps with a flashlight and a broom. Dust hung thick in the air like the breath of someone who had waited a long time to speak. At the far end of the attic, leaning against a brick chimney, she found the mirror. It was tall, nearly 7 feet, framed in tarnished brass, its surface hidden beneath a heavy gray sheet. Something about its size unsettled her. It seemed too grand for such a forgotten space. Still, she pulled the cover away and coughed as the dust scattered like ash. The glass was streaked but intact. When she wiped it clean with her sleeve, she noticed something strange. The reflection behind her didn't match the room. The beams were darker, the window smaller, and the light came not from her flashlight but from something flickering like fire. She turned quickly. The attic looked exactly as it should. When she faced the mirror again, the scene had changed back to normal. She laughed nervously, chalking it up to fatigue, maybe an optical illusion. But that night she dreamt of oil lamps and voices calling names she didn't recognize. Over the next week, Sierra found herself returning to the attic, drawn not by curiosity, but by something subtler, like recognition. Each time she looked into the mirror, the reflection altered slightly. First, the walls behind her shifted. Then the floor became hardwood instead of plywood. Then figures began to appear, faint outlines of people dressed in clothing from another century. One evening, as twilight bled into the sky and Mason had fallen asleep on the couch downstairs, Sierra stood before the mirror longer than she ever had. The woman in the reflection was her. Same face, same eyes, but her hair was pinned in a 19th century bun, and she wore a cream-colored dress with buttons up the throat. This other version didn't mimic her movements. Instead, she stood still, looking directly at her with something between sorrow and invitation. Sierra reached toward the glass. Her finger stopped just short of touching, but the mirror shimmered like water disturbed. She backed away, heart racing, but felt no fear, only a pull. That night she told Mason she was feeling strange, ungrounded. He offered to take her to the beach to step away from the house for a bit. She nodded but didn't mean it. Her mind was somewhere else. Later, while brushing her teeth, she caught a glimpse of herself in the bathroom mirror and saw a second version behind her. For the briefest moment, she turned sharply. Nothing but her toothbrush had fallen to the floor. By the 10th day, Sierra no longer visited the attic. She waited for the attic to come to her. She saw flickers of the other world in every reflective surface. The kitchen window, her phone screen, even the spoon in her morning coffee. The reflections no longer matched. One afternoon, Mason asked why she'd been avoiding him. She said she wasn't. But he looked at her with confusion and said, "You keep staring at things that aren't there." She smiled and said nothing. The attic mirror was no longer just in the attic. It was in her. That evening, during a thunderstorm, Sierra went back upstairs. The mirror was uncovered. She didn't remember removing the cloth, but it lay crumpled beside it like a snake's shed skin. The woman in the mirror was waiting, her eyes kinder now. Behind her, the attic had changed completely. Candles flickered on the beams. There was a rocking chair, a child's toy on the floor, and voices faint but warm. Sierra stepped closer, hand extended. The glass rippled again, a whisper soft as a breath said, "Come home." She didn't remember deciding. She only remembered stepping. The instant she touched the mirror, the attic fell silent. The storm continued outside, but in that room, time paused. The next morning, Mason couldn't find her. Her phone was on the counter, her shoes by the door, but she was gone. The attic looked undisturbed. The mirror stood where it had always been, dustless and cold. He called the police. He searched the woods, but no one ever found her. Weeks later, Mason, sleep-deprived and spiraling, climbed the attic once more and stood before the mirror. And for just a second, he swore he saw her. Not frightened, not trapped, just different. Hair tied up, dressed in linen, walking through an attic lit by oil lamps and laughter. When he blinked, she was gone, and the mirror only showed his own haunted reflection, hollowed by grief. He never touched it again. Not all mirrors show us who we are. Some show us who we used to be. And some perhaps show us where we were meant to go all along. Contracts are made to be broken. But what if the paper signs you? Some homes bind you. Not with chains, but with rules. And if you break them, you don't get punished. You get rewritten. Story 5. The house with its own rules. When Quentin Myers signed the lease for the old house on Glenbrook Lane, it felt like a necessary surrender. After everything his sister's death, the collapse of his department, the slow erosion of every routine that once tethered him, he needed quiet more than answers. The house, a 2-story wood frame with faded green shutters and ivy swallowing one side, stood on the edge of Eugene, Oregon, where the trees grew close and the rain fell softly like apology. It was too cheap. He knew it, but he was too tired to question luck that arrived in envelopes. The woman who handed him the keys introduced herself as Mrs. Halverson. Her hair was gray and tightly wound, and she wore gloves inside. She placed the lease on a doily-covered table and pointed to where he needed to initial. The contract was long, odd. Some clauses he skimmed and thought were jokes like, tenant agrees not to open any rear-facing windows after 11:11 p.m. or hallway mirrors are not to be uncovered under any circumstance. But the price was unbeatable, and he needed a place that didn't ask him questions. He signed. The first week passed uneventfully. The house creaked like any old structure would, and the furnace moaned a little when starting up. But it was quiet, secluded, and filled with the kind of stillness that let Quentin sit and read for hours without interruption. Until one night, forgetting the rules, he hadn't really read. He pulled the kitchen curtain back to look at the street. The clock read 11:12. He stood there for a moment, watching the street lamp flicker just once, then closed the curtain. That night, he dreamt of a door opening slowly, and something with no face stepping through. When he woke, the lease was on the kitchen table, open to a new page. A clause had been added. Tenants shall refrain from exposing interior spaces to external artificial light sources between 11:11 p.m. and 3:33 a.m. The ink was wet. His initials were already there. He didn't remember signing it. He called Mrs. Halverson, but she didn't pick up. He left a message. The next morning, the page was gone as if it had never existed. Days passed, and the lease kept changing. A forgotten porch light left on past midnight resulted in a new clause. Illumination of thresholds during prohibited hours may result in consequences. Another night, after he'd played a voicemail on speaker while brushing his teeth, a clause appeared. Sound must remain contained within physical boundary lines after 10:44 p.m. He tried tearing up the lease. The next morning it was whole again, placed neatly on the table. This time with a clause reminding him not to destroy the lease. The signature at the bottom, his looked older, more rushed, but undeniably his. Then came the noises, low murmurs behind the walls, always at the same time between 11:11 and 3:33. Sometimes it sounded like whispers through water, sometimes like nails tapping slowly in sequence. One night he found a handwritten note tucked under his pillow, written in the same pen as the lease. It read, "The hallway is not a passage after midnight. It is a reflection." He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the living room with all the lights on, watching the shadows grow long and thin across the floor. Just after 2, the lights flickered and dimmed. He heard footsteps from upstairs, even though he hadn't stepped foot on the second floor all week. He climbed the stairs slowly, heart clanging against his ribs. At the top, the hallway stretched longer than he remembered. A single mirror hung at the end, draped in a dark velvet cloth. He didn't touch it, but he swore. Something moved behind the fabric, a shiver like someone breathing just beneath the surface. The next day, he tried to break the lease, called legal aid, but no one could find the listing. The rental office Mrs. Halverson claimed to represent had no record of the address. Public records said the house had been condemned in 2009. Still, the lights worked, the water ran, groceries stayed fresh. He stayed, the lease kept growing. Every page stranger than the last. Rules about shared temporal usage. Warnings about recognizing duplicates. Clauses like, tenant must not acknowledge non-reflections. His days shrank. He stopped writing, stopped calling friends. Each night he sat in the kitchen waiting for the lease to grow, trying to catch it in the act. But the papers always changed when he blinked. One night, in a moment of bitter defiance, he turned on every light in the house, opened all the blinds, sat in front of the hallway mirror and stared at the draped cloth. At 11:11, he pulled it off. The mirror showed the hallway behind him, stretching infinitely in both directions. His own reflection stood still, expression blank. But in the mirror, another version of him, eyes white, lips cracked, began walking forward. He spun around. The hallway was empty, but the mirror version kept approaching. He reached out to touch the glass. His fingers met nothing. The mirror shimmered, and the lease appeared again on the floor at his feet. One final page. No ink. Just a space for a signature. His name already half written. He didn't remember kneeling. Didn't remember the pen. Just the sound of something behind him whispering, "Finish it." When he signed, the house sighed. A long exhale through every pipe and board. Then silence. He was never seen again. The house is still there, listed nowhere. The lights flicker on at night. Some say if you walk past at exactly 11:11, you can see a man standing in the window, staring down at something in his hands. If you look closely, it's paper. He's reading the fine print. Some contracts aren't meant to be understood, just obeyed. And once your name is on the page, what you agree to is no longer your decision. We're used to fearing the storm, the wind, the thunder. But sometimes what comes after the noise is much worse. Because silence isn't always peace. It's pressure. It's what the sky does before it remembers you. Story 6. The night the storm stopped. Dana Whitaker had always found comfort in storms. While others flinched at thunder or scrambled to tape windows shut, she would sit by the glass and let the sound of rain swallow everything else. After years of noise inside her own head, there was something sacred about the way a storm made the world louder than memory. That was why she moved to the edge of the Outer Banks to a weather-beaten house that overlooked a shoreline constantly carved by wind and water. People called it reckless buying a place so close to the ocean, so vulnerable, so temporary. But Dana wasn't looking for permanence. She wanted space to disappear in. And the storms gave her that, until the night one of them didn't. It began like any other summer squall, with a sudden rush of wind slamming against the windows and waves hammering the beach below. Dana wrapped herself in a blanket, poured a cup of tea, and let the familiar chorus settle around her like armor. She read by candlelight, the electricity already gone, and listened as the wind howled through the rafters like something alive. Then at 2:09 a.m., the world fell silent. Not the kind of silence where the storm fades away gradually, but an instant unnatural stillness, as if someone had hit pause on the entire coast. No wind, no rain, no thunder, just an emptiness so complete it hummed in her ears. At first, she thought she'd gone deaf. She knocked her mug against the table. No sound. Her heart thudded, but even that felt distant. She opened the front door and stepped outside. The beach was still. The waves had frozen mid-motion, suspended as if awaiting direction. The air didn't move. The trees didn't sway. The sky, still choked with thick black clouds, hung motionless above her. She whispered hello, and the word left her lips without echo or breath. There was something profoundly wrong. Dana turned back toward the house, but stopped when she saw them. Footprints in the sand. Not hers. Barefoot. Small. Leading from the dunes toward the old path that curved around the cliffside. Her first instinct was to deny them, to rationalize, to retreat. But something ancient stirred inside her. Something tied to another. Summer. Another storm. Another silence. She followed. The footprints led to the abandoned cottage at the edge of the bluff, a place boarded up since before she moved here, a place she hadn't allowed herself to look at in daylight, let alone visit. But now the boards were gone, the door ajar, and the air around it pulsed with the same breathless quiet. She stepped inside. The smell hit her first salt and cedar, and something old like water damaged photographs. The room was arranged exactly as it had been that one weekend when she was 11. The same twin beds, the same crooked lamp, The same floral curtains faded by decades of sun. On the dresser sat a framed photo. She didn't need to pick it up to know what it was. Her and Aaron arms slung around each other, smiling with matching gaps in their teeth. Except this time Dana's face had been scratched out. Deep angry gouges where her image should have been. She backed away, breath-shaking eyes drawn to the mirror above the sink. Her reflection wasn't there. In its place stood Aaron, soaked her hair dark and heavy with seawater, eyes wide like they had been the last time Dana saw her. Dana tried to speak, to apologize, to explain, but no sound came. Only the image of Aaron staring back, lips unmoving, yet somehow whispering through the stillness, "You left me." Dana fell to her knees. She remembered the panic, the helplessness, the choice to run instead of shout. The hours pretending she hadn't seen her sister slip into the tide. She had carried that silence her whole life, and now the world had given her its own. The mirror flickered. Aaron's image began to fade, replaced by the still room behind her, untouched, undisturbed. Dana stood slowly and stepped outside. The footprints were gone. The storm was still absent, but the silence felt lighter now, like it was exhaling. She walked back home, the sand strangely warm beneath her feet. Inside, the clock on the wall ticked again. First one click, then another. Then the wind returned, rattling the shutters, bending the trees, bringing with it the scent of sea and rain. Dana curled up on the couch and waited. The storm roared back to life. It was louder than before, wild and beautiful. But this time it didn't drown her. It carried her. In the morning, she found a photo on her nightstand, the same one from the cottage, but untouched. Her face was still there, smiling beside her sister. The silence hadn't been a void. It had been a reckoning. A space carved out, not by absence, but by the need to remember what had been buried too long. From that day on, Dana didn't fear the storm. What terrified her was the quiet she once needed to survive. Because sometimes the only way to hear what's been waiting is when everything else finally stops speaking. Some doors stay locked for a reason, and some part of us stays behind them. Our next story explores what happens when the room you've avoided your whole life decides to let itself out. Story 7. She Lives Behind the Wall. When Naomi Chen checked into Driftwood Inn, it was supposed to be temporary. A retreat to write again, to rest, to remember how to be someone without noise in her head. The inn sat on the edge of a lake in Vermont, the kind of place you only found if you were looking for silence, or if silence found you first. The air smelled like wet wood and lavender, and the innkeeper didn't ask questions. Only handed her a brass key labeled Room 2 and told her breakfast was at 7, but only if she felt like it. There were 9 rooms, but only 8 were available. Room 3 was locked, always locked. On her second night, Naomi asked casually what was in it. The woman at the desk paused, then smiled like someone remembering a rule they weren't allowed to explain, and said, "That one stays shut." Naomi didn't push. She liked rules, liked boundaries. But that night she heard something strange. Not voices exactly, but a pattern. A slow, soft scratching coming from the shared wall between her room and Room 3. It wasn't mice. It wasn't the wind. It had a rhythm to it, like fingers. She told herself it was the building settling. Old places moved, creaked, groaned. It meant nothing. But the next night, the sound came again. Louder, more insistent, as if whatever made it knew she was listening. Naomi pressed her ear to the wall and heard a whisper. Just one word over and over, almost drowned in the sound of her own pulse. It was her name. Naomi. 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 She stepped back, heart thudding. She didn't sleep. In the morning, the sound was gone, and Room 3 remained locked. She stared at the door too long while passing by, and the cleaning woman, A young woman named Irene looked up from folding towels and said, "Best not to linger near that ones. The guests who do tend to stay longer than they mean." To Naomi half laughed, but it didn't reach her chest. The days were fine. She wrote a little, walked the lake path, read old journals, but the nights pressed in, and room 3 always whispered. One night she dreamed of a hallway that never ended, lit by dim sconces, the carpet patterned with letters she couldn't read. At the far end stood a door slightly open, and behind it she saw herself as a child, back turned, whispering into the dark. When she woke, the scratching had stopped. In its place was a low hum, like someone humming a lullaby from underwater. Naomi stood outside. Room 3 just before dawn, hand hovering over the doorknob that didn't turn. She whispered, "Who are you?" and thought she heard a whisper back, one she hadn't heard in over 20 years. Erin, her sister's name, the one she hadn't said aloud since the accident, since the silence. That night she dreamt of the lake house, of Erin's hair floating like seaweed, of the last time they spoke, of the door her parents told her never to open. She woke to find the air in her room cold and damp, and on the mirror drawn in fog were the words, "You left me there." She didn't run. She couldn't. Instead, she dressed and walked to room 3. The door was open, just enough. Inside, the room was clean but wrong, not dusty or rotting, just paused. On the wall opposite the bed was a large mirror, old and spotted. Naomi stepped in. The door closed behind her. She turned to the mirror and saw a room that wasn't this one. It was a basement, stone walls, flickering light, and in the reflection stood a girl with dark eyes and no mouth. Naomi touched the glass. The girl mirrored her hand to hand, but when Naomi smiled, the girl didn't. Instead, the girl tilted her head and mouthed a word. Naomi, Naomi, Naomi. Her own name echoing from lips that didn't open. Behind the girl in the reflection, another door appeared, and from it a voice she remembered from her nightmare said, "You told them I ran away." Naomi staggered back. The room pulsed with cold. The mirror darkened. When she turned to leave, the door was gone. Only a wall, now solid and whole. She didn't scream. Something in her knew there was no one left to hear it. Outside, the inn remained quiet. Irene passed by room 2 later that day and noticed the key was on the table. The bed unslept. The journal on the desk still open to a blank page. She didn't ask questions. No one did. Mrs. Finch. The owner simply walked to room 3, locked it gently, and said, "It's always the ones who don't ask that. Find it." Naomi was never seen again, but some nights guests in room 2 swear they hear 2 voices through the wall, one scratching, one humming, and sometimes they say the mirror fogs on its own. Not all locked rooms are prisons. Some are invitations. Some doors are meant to stay closed because what's behind them isn't trying to escape. It's trying to become you. And finally, there are places you don't find. They find you. Hollow towns, empty bells, roads that vanish after you take them. This last story is about a sound that won't stop until you finally listen. Story 8. The Bell at Hollow Creek. Elena Rodriguez had never believed in omens, but something about Hollow Creek unsettled her from the moment she passed the faded welcome sign. The town was too quiet, too neat, too tucked away between roads that weren't on any map. She hadn't planned to stop. Her GPS had rerouted twice without explanation, and her phone flickered between signal and silence like it couldn't decide if she was still in the world or somewhere just adjacent to it. She told herself it was nothing. Just bad reception, just a shortcut, just a small detour on the way to her cousin's wedding in Asheville. She told herself a lot of things, It was only when she heard the bell that she stopped walking. It rang once, sharp, sudden, too loud for a town so still. It didn't echo, it didn't repeat. It simply rang and then stopped like a warning with no follow-up. Elena glanced around. There was no church, no bell tower, just rows of Victorian houses, each perfectly maintained, each with windows closed tight, curtains drawn. The sidewalks were cracked. The air smelled faintly of smoke and metal. She continued on foot, car parked just outside of town. With a warning light she didn't recognize flashing red across the dash. She passed a post office that looked more like a mausoleum, a diner with no menu, a general store with shelves full of products, but no labels. The people, when they appeared, didn't speak. They nodded politely, smiled too long, moved like they were remembering how she asked where she could find a mechanic. A woman with hair like spider silk and eyes like fog simply pointed toward the other end of town and said, "Just follow the sound." Elena didn't hear anything, but nodded. The bell rang again. This time it was closer. She turned around. No one else seemed to notice. It was as if the town inhaled each chime and swallowed it before it could bounce. She walked toward the noise, past houses that looked lived in but weren't alive, past children sitting on porches not blinking, past mailboxes filled with letters that had no addresses. She reached a stone path that led into the woods. The air grew colder. The bell rang a third time. This time it came from just ahead. As she stepped off the road, her phone buzzed. A message blinked onto the screen. No sender, no number, just 5 words. "Don't answer when it rings." She froze. The message vanished. She stared at the empty screen. When she looked up, the bell stood before her. Not a tower, not a building. Just a single rusted bell suspended between 2 trees on a wooden frame. Its rope knotted and frayed, its surface etched with names too worn to read. And below it stood a man, thin, pale, wearing the kind of clothes that didn't belong to any decade she could name. He looked at her like he'd been waiting. "It's early," he said, voice brittle as dry leaves. "You shouldn't be here yet." Elena stepped back. "I'm just lost. My car. Everyone's car breaks down here," he said, not unkindly. "That's how the town finds who it's looking for." She didn't know what that meant. She didn't want to know. She turned to leave, but the bell rang again. Not by the man's hand, not by the wind, just rang, and she felt it in her bones like a memory of a scream. The man sighed. "Now it's heard you." Elena ran down the path, back past the houses, past the smiles, past the windows that no longer had curtains but eyes. Her car was gone. The space it occupied was now just gravel. No tire marks, no oil stains, no sign it had ever been there. She checked her phone. Dead. The bell rang again. She covered her ears, but the sound wasn't in the air anymore. It was inside her, behind her ribs, under her skin. The town had stopped pretending. The people no longer smiled. They watched, heads tilted, still as tombstones. She ducked into the diner, but it was empty. Table set, but no chairs. Plates laid out, but no food. A mirror on the wall showed the dining room, except in the reflection she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a version of herself. Eyes closed, mouth open, a rope burned around her neck. The bell rang. Her reflection didn't flinch. Outside, the man appeared in the doorway. "You need to remember now," he said, "or it won't let you leave." Remember what she whispered, but she already knew. The silence. The choice. The sound of someone else crying out and her not turning back. A night 15 years ago, when a friend begged her to stop the car to help, and she kept driving. A night no one ever found out about. The bell rang again. Elena fell to her knees. The sound wasn't a call. It was a toll. A claim Hollow Creek didn't punish. It reminded. It brought back what you buried, gave it form, gave it shape, gave it a mouth to scream through again and again until you listened. Until you remembered fully. Until you stayed. She looked up. The people of the town had gathered silently around the bell, now watching, waiting. Not cruel, not kind. Just keepers of memory that wouldn't fade. Elena stood slowly. She walked back toward the woods, past the man who stepped aside, to the bell which waited without judgment. She took the rope in her hands. It felt familiar, like she'd held it once in a dream, or maybe in a life she tried too hard to forget. She rang it once. The town exhaled it. Somewhere in another world, the welcome sign faded just a little more. Some roads disappear from the map, not because they lead nowhere, but because they lead back to what you swore you'd never face again. Hollow Creek wasn't lost. It was waiting, and the bell was never broken. It just waits to be heard. Some memories fade for a reason, but others, they come back because you buried them alive. And when they return, they don't knock. They ring over and over. Thanks for staying with us until the end. If this story echoed something deep inside you, you're not alone. We'll be waiting here next time, just beyond the veil.